Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's episode 38 of The Pick List. Have you had a good week so far?
Hello Laura, yes, a very good week. Thank you. I've done another trade media masterclass earlier this week, so that's all about training PRs and how to write better press releases and get into the trade press. And I'm also working on a feature article at the moment about brands and how they can hold on to some of the growth they have seen in 2020. What have you been up to?
Sounds fascinating. I love it. Busy week. I'm busy preparing some work for the UN Food Systems Summit and COP26 as well. So doing a lot of work for the global meat industry on that and loving it, finding out so much. And as you know, my favourite pastime, talking to people. So that's very enjoyable. This week's podcast, we've got a great guest, haven't we?
We have indeed. We're joined by Bill Bean. Bill is EVP Research at Shopper Intelligence. He joined us from Los Angeles, so it was a rare opportunity to get a more international perspective and find out what's been happening with shopper trends in the US.
Should we start the show?
Bill, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Why don't you briefly introduce yourself and tell a listener who you are, what you do, and how you're connected to food and grocery retail?
Well, my name is Bill Bean, and I've worked in shopper research for probably the last 20 years, doing research on how people shop and what that means for marketing and sales operations for 4 or 5 of the largest consumer packaged goods companies in the world. I've worked for Pepsi and Kraft Foods, Colgate-Palmolive, SAB Miller Brewing, for Mattel Toys. So I have broad experience on shopping in a lot of different food and personal care products. The last few years, I've worked for an international research agency based in the UK called Shopper Intelligence, where I'm executive vice president of insights and research, where we actually now study and bring to the market data about how people shop.
Fantastic. And you're joining us from Los Angeles today.
Yes.
So before we jump into your articles, I know our listeners will find it really interesting to just get a sense of how shopper behavior has changed in the US as a result of the pandemic. We talk a lot about this on the podcast with a focus on the UK. Could you perhaps pick out one standout change that you have seen in how US grocery shoppers behave?
It's really important when you consider this question to separate out what have been artificial changes in shopping and what have been more central changes to shopper and consumer mindset. And so for example, what I mean is that as soon as the lockdowns happened last March or April, every retailer in the US imposed specific and extensive changes in traffic flow in their stores. That wasn't a shopper choice. That was retailers deciding on their own, each one deciding on their own what they thought might be the safest way to approach retail, right? And that changed everything that we know about how assortments work, about how people move through a store, about which aisle they approach and which they don't, what they see along that journey, which has been, for 100 years, part of retail management folklore and science. It just changed it literally over about a 2-week span. And those artificial changes really just swept through just about everything we know about shopper and how people behave in the stores. And then those in turn created some attitudinal changes at the core of how people shop that may or may not endure. And frankly, I don't think anyone knows what will last and what won't. We can see what's happened. So the two things that we focused on the most, one of which I think is enduring, and the other is an interesting question, has been the shift to digital. And I think we'll end up, given the articles we've chosen, we'll end up talking about this a lot more later. But here in the U.S., the shift to online shopping has been massive, and it happened easily 5 years ahead of what anyone predicted it would be, because that's what the pandemic required. We've seen increases in most categories as high as 30% of first time online shopping. We've seen increases in sales of also in that range between 30 and 50% of just wholesale shift to online and digital and delivery and basically anything a retailer could think of to um, to drive those changes. And I think that one's enduring. The one that we see literally in every country we measure, and I'm not sure it's going to change, is that because of the stresses in the supply chain that created the sort of massive and weird, what people perceived as weird out of stocks and shortages and et cetera, people really opened up their brand consideration sets. So, I mean, really opened it up. Like people who used to tell us they had, 3 favorite brands and they would never try anything else. Now all of a sudden are going, oh, private label looks pretty good. It's not as bad as I thought it was. I'll try private label. Categories where previously they just refused to look at those brands. Now they're going, yeah, that's pretty good. I'll do that. And that happened because they had to, but who knows how many people will snap back to the way things were before. Shoppers are driven everywhere by convenience. They talk a good game, but if you wave something that's easy and cheap in front of them, they almost always go, "Oh, I'll do that."
That's really interesting. And of course, the pick list is all about highlighting interesting articles all to do with food and drink and grocery
Hmm.
retail. So we do want to quiz you a little bit on your reading habits as well. How do you keep up to date with what's happening in the industry? What are some publications that you enjoy reading?
And one of the articles I have is from a regular update publication here in the U.S. called the Robin Report, which is a fairly regular update of original articles and curated articles about the retail industry. Maybe 5 or 6 articles a week. They're all easy reading. They jump out, and so I get that as a newsletter feed. I read that regularly, and then because I'm not a pure marketer. I'm an insights professional. I read research articles a lot, and in the U.S., the Advertising Research Foundation publishes a lot of free articles that are empirically, scientifically based about how advertising and shopping works. WARC in the UK is a similar organization, WARC. And then the last one, which is just for me, if anyone is interested in sort of easily digestible but highly scientific article about how marketing and retail works, the organization to go to here is called the Marketing Science Institute, MSI, which is an organization of manufacturers and academics who have come together for over 60 years to sort of advance our knowledge of how marketing, shopping, and sales works, both organizationally and behaviorally. And they have a regular newsletter where they just regularly um, re- present synopses of really highly rigorous research on how marketing and retail works, but you get to see them in a paragraph or two. And those are my three go-to places.
Fantastic. But tell us about your first article for us.
Well, the first article, as we discussed, is from the most recent edition of the Robin Report, A Tale of Two Generations, in a recent, and it is about how, similar to the question you asked me before, how differences among the primary buying generations, so baby boomers, millennials, and Gen X, they're called, are still driving retail, and how the pandemic has placed those generations in very different positions to revive retail as it comes back post-pandemic. And I chose this article because aging consumers has been a pet topic of mine for 20 years, because the because populations all over the world have been aging, literally aging since the early 50s, since the early 1950s. And starting about 10 years ago, the marketers that I worked with, only about 10 years ago, which had just always amused me no end, they started coming to me with questions that I could only summarize as, where did all these old people come from? Where did they come from? All of a sudden, they're old people buying stuff. Where did they come from? And you're going, it's this has been the aging population around the world has been the longest running macro trend on everybody's chalkboard since literally the 1960s. And now all of a sudden, people are going, oh my God, people are old. What's happened? In Japan, 60% of the population is over age 50. 60% of the population is over age 50. And so what makes that interesting now in the pandemic period, and the article talks about it, is that in a world where, in the US, for example, 70% of the wealth, 70% of the wealth is in the baby boomer generation, people who are 50, 55 and older. Only 10% of the marketing dollars are directed to them. And that's because marketing and retail has always been directed at sort of two reasons. Always been directed at the midpoint, because they figured those are the people who have jobs and they have money to spend, and that's not wrong. But then the other thing, which ties back to where did all these old people come from, it's that for the longest time, the largest generation was young. and so people don't think about how they're just getting older. They just it's always astounded me. They just don't think about it. They just think that that will always be the sweet spot of marketing. And this article points out, particularly post-pandemic, that it is not. In fact, the pandemic has hit the generations very differently. That young people have the lowest amount of savings, and whereas pre-pandemic, they were the ones who spent the most on food, eating out, partying, bars and restaurants. A huge percentage of their expenditure was devoted to those things. And so a lot of the marketing and sales dollars and retail outlets were built for them. But post-pandemic, they don't have any money. They've lost a lot of their jobs. They're now saving for the first time in their lives, whereas baby boomers are the ones that have money and they're expected to spend. And as I was talking about earlier, they've increased their digital spending 30%. They're the ones who are driving food delivery at food stores. So post-pandemic, the message is that you ignore these older people at your peril. And then the last thing I'll say about it which is not in the article, but it's my opinion, is that most advertisers and marketing don't have a clue how to talk to older people. Their impressions of being old are usually about 20 years behind what is actually how older people behave. The perception of the boomer generation is that they're really old. They never leave the couch. They never exercise. They're sick. They're weak. They don't have any money, all of which is just completely wrong.
The only thing I would add to that list, Bill, is they also wear beige. I think that's the other thing that marketeers think
Yeah,
that,
they wear
and
beige.
they wear beige. And thank you so much for bringing the Robin report. It wasn't on my radar, and I really loved the article. And it was really interesting to listen to your opinion there about marketeers not knowing how to talk to this generation. I also got a sense from the article that marketeers don't necessarily think it's cool and the funky thing to be doing, to be, targeting a brand at that generation. They want to be doing the cutting edge tech that's maybe targeted at youngsters. Whereas, as you say in the article, maps out really nicely that this is a huge area to focus on. And I guess it made me reflect on the digital leap that my parents have made in the last year now, that they would never shop for food online, and now I don't think they'll ever probably go back to a supermarket, probably because A, they don't want to, and B, they think I can do all this other stuff with the time. What was I spending twice a week bothering shopping and doing that, when if I want to pop to a local farm shop and get some nice stuff there, I can, but the basic stuff then get online. And as you say, we probably would have got that shift for younger generations to digital, but the opportunity now for the baby boomers is just phenomenal.
It's huge.
Julia, what's your first pick this week?
My first pick this week is from The Spoon, and it's an article titled "Will Grocery Delivery Become the Next Utility?" And I thought, in the week of the Deliveroo IPO and general discussion about the future of delivery and grocery delivery and the value and profitability around delivery, that this was an interesting question to be asking. The argument that's being explored in this article by Chris Albrecht of The Spoon is as follows. As Bill has already alluded to, we've seen a massive shift to online buying as a result of the pandemic, not just in the US, but also here in the UK. And there's an expectation that a lot of this shift will be permanent, that many more people in countries like the UK and the US will be buying their groceries online. A lot of that is happening through grocery retailers, of course, but there is this crop of new players getting involved in the delivery side of online grocery. And they are, as Chris describes it, offering grocery as service. Groceries on demand, delivered in 10 or 15 minutes in many cases. Deliveroo, of course, is the one we're talking about this week, but there is Get Here, there's Gorillas, there's GoPuff, there's Wheezy and Jiffy and Fridge No More. There's a whole range of players sort of competing for that last mile, and they're all attracting quite a bit of attention and investment at the moment. The model here is all about super fast delivery, taking the friction out of grocery shopping and having your shopping delivered. As Chris describes it, it's basically getting groceries becomes like getting water to your home. Whenever you need it, you can just fire up an app and have groceries appear. And that has some potentially interesting implications for how we shop and how we think about food and groceries. If you can have always-on speedy grocery delivery within 10 minutes, how does that affect the way you think about food, the way you plan your meals, for example? Is it essentially like a top-up shop but done through an app, or will it change our relationship with food more fundamentally? And I suppose for me, the article raised two questions. One around the idea of impulse buying. Impulse has been such a difficult category to do through e-commerce because you have that lag between wanting a product and then actually being able to have it delivered. And also because of minimum orders and basket sizes, which all means that you're typically not really looking to buy individual bars of chocolate online. But with these new grocery last mile specialists, If you're able to get your groceries delivered within 10 minutes, less time than it might take to go to your local shop, do you suddenly open up a whole raft of product categories and product types to e-commerce? Essentially, does impulse become viable in an online setting with this delivery setup? And then the second question it raised for me was around the implications for retailers. In terms of owning the customer relationship, of course, but also, I suppose, a more fundamental question of, what is a retailer for in this context? We've had a lot of discussion about this idea of the great unbundling of the grocery store, where on the one hand you have more brands selling direct to consumer, cutting out the retailer, and then you have meal kit and recipe box operators competing for dinner, and you have these last mile specialists offering super speedy delivery. So a lot of the roles that retailers traditionally would have fulfilled are being divided up and taken on by specialists. So in that environment, what's the point, and what's the point of difference for a retailer? Bill, what did you make of the article?
Well, I had a few reactions. To it. One was the degree to which the businesses in the article presented as new economy solutions to retail. If you just turn your head slightly and take the tech app out of the equation, I was struck by how many of those businesses look like business my parents used. That the article, for example, describes a ghost kitchen operation where you've got people toiling away in industrial kitchens, and then the food is just delivered to your door. Well, that sounded a lot like catering to me, only they didn't call it catering. They called it some revolutionary new thing. And it's clearly just a catering business with delivery, right? It's the same business model with an app stuck in the middle of it. And so I was struck by how just the language of this article made everything look revolutionary when at its core it was pretty old. My parents used to get grocery delivery all the time. We had a truck come by the house when I was a kid, would deliver fresh food from a truck, like every 2 weeks would come by and do it that way. It became expensive, so nobody does that anymore. House calls disappeared. All of that stuff disappeared because it was expensive. So the technology, in theory, makes it cheaper, so it's all coming back. The implications that you've spun out and the article spins out, and the imagination of the future completely changes the way the human resource aspects of this business work, right? So restaurants, retail, they're here in the US, they're all unionized, right? So people have fought hard to get a working wage out of a fairly manual job. And the ultimate, all the way down the yellow brick road implications of any tool like this is that all of those people are cut out of the equation. Like if I go into, it was one of my lasting personal impressions of the pandemic here in LA, is I went into my Whole Foods, my local Whole Food store, and easily a third of the physical space in that store was devoted to delivery now. They'd taken out all of the food service stuff because they couldn't do that during the pandemic. They have here in the US, it is a wonderful catering food on delivery option out of Whole Foods. The food is delicious, it's well prepared, it's well presented. All of that stuff was taken out during the pandemic. And instead, that space had become a staging area for pickers, people who just went around the store putting stuff in bags for delivery and pickup.
I guess the other aspect of this article I was interested in, if speed of service is going to become one of the drivers for purchase, what else are retailers going to differentiate on? What else is important? And we hear a lot, yes, that value for money is important, but we hear a lot more about sustainability, and I know we're going to come on to that in a second. but what are the differentiators for those products, and then also what's left in terms of retail store themselves. And you talking there, Bill, about Whole Foods. They're a masterclass in in-store theatre. Will we see the others? And particularly in the UK, we've got a real challenging amount of retailers here, and they normally just drive on price. Will they have to look at different aspects and get more theatre in store to get folks to stay loyal to them?
Laura, what's your first pick for us?
My first pick this week is from Agriland, and it's titled "Research Shows that UK Grocery Shopping Habits Have Changed to Combat Food Waste." And I was really fascinated by this. It's a new report that's out from Pro Agrica, and it's a survey of around about 1,000 shoppers of UK adults over the last couple of months. And it's thrown up some really interesting stats I would love to get your thoughts on. One of the biggest stats is said that 63% of consumers say they're more likely to shop more often in smaller quantities to avoid throwing away products and to avoid waste. That really goes against the data that we've seen recently, that shoppers are shopping less, they're buying more, they're going back to traditional ways. So what that triggered me straight away was that difference between what shoppers say they're going to do and what they actually do. So that was the first thing, because the data that we're seeing maybe doesn't fully endorse that at the moment, that folks are upping their frequency again. Really interesting as well that shoppers are saying that 67% are buying more frozen, and we have seen that a little bit, that frozen has been a strong beneficiary out of COVID, but to see such a high stat around that. Another stat which really made me chuckle, actually, 76% of UK shoppers would like to buy more ugly fruit and veg, so which did make me wonder how the questions were posed, because it's interesting, different initiatives that are coming out of that category. In particular, I see M&S over the last week or so have started to sell a bag of ripened bananas, so you can take those home and make your banana bread. So there is more and more, I guess, MPD coming around there. And then one of the other stats which I thought was fascinating, we're always keen to blame big corporates, aren't we, around food waste, and it's either the government's fault or the supermarket's fault or the supply chain. But this data shows that 42% of shoppers say that food waste issues lies with them. And I think it shows that we're all probably quite conscious of the fact at the end of the week, or whenever you may be dropping food in the bin that's past its sell by date, and you're thinking actually it's gone off. So folks are aware of that. And then the last stat that I wanted to share was 32% say that they are interested in ethical considerations such as certification influencing their buyer decisions. And I was really shocked how low that was, only 32%. And again, it might have been down to the way that the question was asked, but some fascinating stats. Bill, what are your thoughts, and how, your amazing career in this space, the difference between what consumers say they're going to do and actually do, how big is that void?
Well, the short answer is it's a huge void and always has been. And you can always ask a question of a shopper to get the answer that you want. That's always been true about research. So I wondered about those while I was reading these statistics too. And not having access to the survey, I had no idea how the question was asked or what they were doing, but it did seem a little pat. I think the other thing relative to the article I recommended is that this is one of the areas, food waste and cause marketing, where there are big differences in generations. So younger consumers and shoppers, probably for the last 10 years or so, have talked about how important ethics are to them and certain causes are to them, whereas older consumers doesn't matter as much. It matters, but it doesn't matter as much. And so often it's a kind of hit or miss. Betting on which cause will work for your brand, whether retail or manufacturer, is a hit or miss thing. Might work, might not work. It also and so food waste is one of those things. And then the third thing, which the article does, which your reaction raised a little bit for me, but the article doesn't talk about, is I think for every for everything a shopper says that they want to do or would do or can do, there's probably 5 things that are being done. I wanted to say to them. That's not the right phrase I want to use. There are probably 5 things that marketers are doing that counteract what they want to do. We've talked about 2 a lot on this conversation: speed and price. Oh yeah, food waste is a big issue to me. I'm going to buy smaller, but as soon as I see, a 2-for-1 deal, I'm buying 7 avocados, right? I've only ever in my entire life eaten 1 avocado in a week, but this week I'm going to buy 7 of them and I'm going to eat them all.
The one bit that stood out to me that I thought was quite interesting was this interest in ugly produce. There was some quite interesting an interesting study that came out a while ago that looked at the efficacy of certain language around misshapen or ugly produce, and that seemed to find that actually, I have a feeling it was US based. They found that actually using the term ugly as opposed to something slightly more diplomatic like misshapen, did a much better job of convincing consumers that they should be buying this, because there was a sort of sense that if, as the retailer, you're being this blunt about the flaws, it kind of makes you come across as more transparent, and it made the shoppers feel more confident in choosing produce like that, which I thought was really interesting. Bill, tell us about your second pick for us.
My second pick is an article from the Christian Science Monitor that's called "Why Business Startups Are Booming." And to me, this was a really fascinating article about what's really going on in the economy recently with the pandemic in the United States that runs counter to a lot of the narrative that has been in the business press or anecdotally in people's lives. And the article points out that starting at about midway through the pandemic shutdown last year, like June or July, that business startups of all kinds in the United States were increased by as much as a third or 50% over the year before. And at a time when the narrative is more about how many restaurants are closing and who's in trouble and who's not, right? Oh my God, the economy's going down the trash can because of the pandemic. And while a lot of that is true, many people were out of work. Certainly in Los Angeles here, which is a premier food town, food city in the United States, there's been lamentations for a year about people's favorite restaurants that have closed down. But the data show that others businesses, other food related business, including new grocery stores, including new pastry shops, including new restaurants of just about every kind, are up about 30%. The applications for starting those new businesses is just gigantic. It's really just an extraordinary counter narrative to what people's anecdotal impressions have been. How well any of these businesses work is still a question and always will be for any business that opens up. But when you've got, um, when times are tough, people get innovative. They do stuff they wouldn't normally do, including borrowing money to open a storefront retail outlet in the middle of a pandemic. It's risky, but it's also just inspiring to me. It's just inspiring.
It's totally inspiring, and I really like the article and the fact that there was a comment in there about female-led businesses, and we've read a lot, haven't we, over the last year that females in particular have been hit hard by the pandemic. Be that, the over-index in those service jobs, as we've spoken about, that have maybe been heavily affected, and some of the opportunities that they're now capitalising on for these new food businesses and independent startups is really inspiring and very powerful.
And it's that word, that inspiring, is like just sums up how I felt about this article. There's a lot of data in it, but at the end of the day, which I'm always attracted to, but at the end of the day, it was just an inspiring message. Let's go figure this out. Let's do something new. Let's see if it works.
Julia, what's your second pick this week?
My second pick this week is from Modern Retail, and it's an article titled "Influencers Are Infiltrating Ghost Kitchens with the Help of Planet Hollywood's Founder." So we're continuing to look at online food delivery, and we're continuing quite a few of the themes that we've touched on in this discussion already. This particular article focuses on a business called Virtual Dining Concepts, which is a ghost kitchen company operating in the US that specializes in partnerships with celebrities and influencers. And Bill, I liked what you said earlier about how ghost kitchens are potentially just a new technology-led way of thinking about catering. This is catering with some more celebrities and influencers thrown in. So instead of having a famous restaurant brand licensing their menu and recipes to a ghost kitchen for delivery, you have names like Mariah Carey offering products for delivery. She's doing cookies, incidentally. It's basically, as the article says, the Planet Hollywood business model, but reinvented for the food delivery and ghost kitchen aid. And one of the reasons we're seeing this partnership between ghost kitchens and celebrities and influencers is partly because this market is hugely competitive now. I thought there were some eye-popping stats in this particular article. Last July, the US had 1,500 ghost kitchens, and it probably has many more now. And Euromonitor expects the global ghost kitchen market to be worth $1 trillion by 2030. So this is getting really crowded, and there's a lot of pressure to differentiate, and therefore having exclusive celebrity or influencer products and menus is potentially one way to do that. And it's also a way to help with customer acquisition. These people have huge social media followings already, and they can therefore funnel lots of people towards certain delivery apps. And one of the examples mentioned in the article is Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast is a super successful content creator who has more than 55 million YouTube subscribers. In December, Mr. Beast launched 300 digital restaurants around the US called Mr. Beast Burger. He announced this on his YouTube channel, of course. The post got a gazillion views. His ordering app hit the #1 spot on Apple's App Store, and to date, he has done over 1 million transactions. In all this, the role played by the restaurants and, of course, the people that work in the ghost kitchens and prepare these celebrity marketed meals is interesting, and as Bill has touched on a little earlier, is controversial as well. You know, on the one hand, ghost kitchen operators are really keen to point out that their model has provided a lifeline for struggling restaurants, especially during COVID. On the other hand, there's a lot of debate around working conditions and also the power dynamics between restaurants and the people who work in these kitchens and the operators and the people behind these apps. And I suppose there's a sort of wider question of, you know, what happens when you separate people from food, when you sort of break that link between who you think you're buying into and the person who's actually preparing the food for you. Although if we go with Bill's definition that this is really just a fancy new way to talk about catering, then I suppose it was it's always been that way anyway. Bill, tell me, what did you make of this article and this idea of celebrity delivery meals?
Now, I've been in lifestyle marketing a few times. I worked in, for a beer company. I worked for Pepsi Cola. You know, we spent millions of dollars on celebrity spokespeople. We sponsored bands, we sponsored music. I would see routinely at our national sales meetings huge names, music stars now. I would see them when they were babies because we'd identify them and we'd bring them in. I saw the Black Eyed Peas on a Sunday morning at a corporate event, for example, right? So I've worked for companies that believe in this kind of influence. It works. It's a little different in the digital age because fame is generated differently. But the data shows, in fact, no one really knows how or when it will work. It's just that people always believe it does and they'll work with it. And some concepts, Planet Hollywood's a good example, where you've got 5 or 6 big Hollywood names and you go to the restaurant and the idea is that you sort of share in that experience of Bruce Willis or Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? And what's interesting to me about that is that it is a physical experience in that situation, whereas this business proposition is a home experience. And so what's critical to make this work is actually the food, because in the other, on the retail side, the in-store bricks and mortar experience, it is a consumption experience in an environment that is amazing. Whereas this one is a consumption experience. You're eating a Mariah Carey cookie in your kitchen, right? To me, that's just a huge gap, no matter how revolutionary the technology they talk about is.
I love this article as well, probably because I'm a bit of a sucker for celebrity endorsements and I always like to see what they're up to. And I couldn't decide if this was a good thing or a bad thing, but the whole Mariah Carey and cookies, I just think that doesn't naturally fit into her portfolio, does it? If this was
No,
Gwyneth Paltrow talking about green salads and meat-free opportunities, then I think, yeah, that works and I get it. But this feels a bit of a stretch, and where it sort of fell in my head is where sort of when you go into a sort of a budget pharmacy and they've got some nice perfumes behind them and they say, do you want this one? And it's £12.99 and it's celebrity endorsed Britney Spears or whoever it may be. And you think Britney's probably not wearing that perfume the same as, I don't think Mariah's eating these cookies. So then I think, well, who's the market for them? As you say, Bill, I love a bit of Planet Hollywood or dare I even say Bubba Gump shrimp. I love all that stuff. But you're right, you're going because it's the atmosphere and the
yeah.
atmospherics. Whereas if you're just getting a Mariah Carey cookie at home, then you're probably just getting it to take a photo and put on your own Insta feed. It's probably not for the taste or the enjoyment unless it's the best cookie you've ever tasted. And I'm guessing Mariah's probably not an expert in that sort of area.
Laura, what's your second pick for us?
My second pick this week is from the grocer, and it's Mars Pet Care launches Lovebug dry cat food range made from insects, and really like this. And to give you a bit of background, this is it launched by Mars just this week, and it's a new brand exclusively from insects. The Lovebug brand is made from black soldier fly larvae, and it's totally dry food. It also has some amino acids in it and has a vegan coating for your cat. It's made in Germany but sold exclusively in the UK, and it's the first to market over here. And what I really liked about it was a couple of things. First of all, the branding is really impactful, and it always makes me think back to when Julie and I talked specifically about the meat industry and how we've got a long way to go on branding and how the meat-free market is funky and impactful. I thought they've done it again on pet food. It looks really engaging. And then there's quite a bit about sustainability in the article as well. It talks about the insects taking up less space than beef production, for example. It talks about the production system here being used from renewable energy. and it also talks about how cats thrive on this product and cats will be happy. And then it also goes on to talk about pet parents, which I really liked, because in the UK alone we've got 3 million more pets in the last 12 months, so a lot of folks will be thinking they're new pet parents, and making owners happy with good environmental choices. And I thought it's a disruptor. It's interesting for maybe for cat parents that maybe not meat eaters themselves, or more focusing on sustainability. But I guess the question in my mind it raised, and unsurprisingly working so much in the meat industry, at what point does an insect and a bug become an animal? And in terms of, will we see the next brand extension of this being and the welfare of the black soldier fly larvae, and they're in, I don't know, in this sort of environment, and that will become as equally important further down the line, because I don't know, I think there may be an animal too, and that will become
Interesting.
important, and that transparency on the supply chain. Am I being crazy, Bill? Is there a lot of in LA? You've got I'm guessing some avant-garde pet parents. Are they feeding their cats insects?
Uh, Short answer, no, but it has nothing to do with desirability. I love this article for the branding reasons. I thought Lovebug was a great name for this, but it's also um, insects are not an approved protein ingredient for pets in the U.S. They're approved for reptile feeding. You can feed your iguana something that's based on fly protein, but nothing else. It's approved for treats because there's one or two brands that use um, the black soldier fly larvae, which by the way is a magical and astounding sustainability ingredient. It just really is a fascinating kind of approach to this. But different regulations in the U.S. So everyone is kind of experimenting in the pet food industry, um, but it's in fact illegal to market currently a full up pet food made from insect source protein, and it's only approved for certain farm and reptile applications. So we don't see it, but I like it. Again, I think the sustainability issue of this is just remarkable. Everything lines up really neatly for this product. Whether or not that'll be a motivating factor for consumers, I don't know.
I thought the article was really interesting as well, and I was fascinated to see that we are now seeing a commercial launch like this, and from a really big brand name as well. And we've talked about the potential around insect protein quite a few times on the podcast, and I think it's so interesting that pet food is potentially the way to get this into the mainstream, because there are obviously still quite a few barriers if you're trying to get Western consumers in particular to sort of buy into the idea of insect protein. There's some interesting startups that are trying to be really innovative and are looking at using insects as an ingredient, but the barriers I think are still quite considerable. There's always that danger that it's just a little bit too much in that novelty niche, whereas I think with pet food you potentially don't have quite the same issues, and pet parents are also increasingly sustainability minded. So yeah, I think a really, really interesting way to see a big mainstream name embrace insect protein.
And I don't. The other thing that was, just interesting to see how it plays out is that sustainability actually wasn't part of the marketing proposition very much. When you read through the article, they only mention it a little bit. Where in fact, economically and you know ecologically, philosophically, it's actually a really big deal on this product. It's a huge deal. The a, a, a fly farm like this is almost 50% more productive in producing protein than any meat agricultural operation. And you do it in a, you know, you do it in a plastic bin the size of my desk, basically. It's just a remarkable algebra, and yet they're not marketing it that way. It's just almost an afterthought. So I worked in pet food for a little while. Cats are interesting. They're what's called obligate carnivores. They really don't eat much else but meat. But they also require an amino acid that typically is not present in most protein sources, which is taurine, and which, by the way, is one of the main ingredients in most energy drinks.
Hmm.
But cats require it, and the black fly larvae make it. So it's a complete protein for them. They'll supplement. This one's supplemented with taurine as well, but unlike fish or meat, the flies produce it. So it just ends up again just being a remarkably efficient cat food.
Bill, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being our guest.
My pleasure. It turned out to be a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating, and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.